One of the challenges facing storytellers, particularly for journalists whose job it is to keep people informed, is keeping an audience's attention, making sure that they stay engaged so that they hear not just the beginning of the story, the exciting details at the beginning, but the important details throughout the middle and all the way to the end. Often, when a story is new and fresh and exciting, people are desperate for details. In times like that, especially when you've got good access to a story, the job can feel easy, as though you're a conduit for the message and its recipient. But audiences, like all of us, are fickle and we have limited attention spans. As soon as the story starts to develop, especially if it's a story overseas or it's a story in a culture that they are less familiar with, audiences can lose attention and move on to the next story. The original story, even if it has only just begun to unfold, can become forgotten as a new, shinier, more enticing story takes its place. It's an issue we've come back to again and again on this podcast with journalists such as Nabiha Bullos and Beltrue and Arwa Damon. Lyse Doucet has been reporting from Afghanistan for 4 decades, and throughout that time, the story of Afghanistan has developed socially, politically, and culturally. In many ways, it's a story that has been with us in various forms for all of that period. At times, it's been straightforward to keep audiences engaged through the mediums that Lyse knows so well, television and radio. But now, 4 years after the Taliban dramatically regained control of Kabul, and with it the rest of Afghanistan, Lyse is worried that her audience's attention is slipping from the country that she knows and loves so well. Her answer to that perennial question of how to keep attention on a story is to tell it from a different perspective. For the first time in her long and illustrious career, she's written a book called The Finest Hotel in Kabul. Taking the Intercontinental Hotel in the city and the characters that staff its halls as its backdrop, Lyse's book describes, as the subtitle says, a people's history of Afghanistan from the 1970s all the way through to the present day. I brought Lyse onto the podcast to discuss the book, how Afghanistan and her craft have changed in the years since she's been reporting there, and the personal challenges of having your life in thrall to an unforgiving news cycle. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here's this week's episode of The Lead.
To be with you, Faisal. Really love your podcast. Really congratulations again and again on New Lines. It goes from strength to strength in terms of the storytelling, and you've got many cheering you on, including me.
Thank you so much, Lyse. This is very kind. But I wanted to give the audience a sense of what's just happened. So we are recording on Tuesday, and we were going to meet at 3:00 London time. And then just before we met, or we were going to meet, something happened. And it's the reason why, as I look at you and I'm speaking to you, I can see you checking your phone. So do you want to tell the audience what...
So here it is, Faisal. It is a gorgeous September day. So I had a meeting and I decided to walk home. And I was listening to the BBC's NewsHour program as I came, and they were doing an item on... it just was in the middle, just after they'd done the protest in Nepal, and they interrupted the interview and said, "Excuse me, we've got breaking news. There are explosions in Doha, the capital of Qatar." And so I thought, I just met some senior Qataris at the weekend, and so my antenna went up, and they said they seem to be explosions targeting Hamas officials who are living in Gaza. And the presenter of the NewsHour program says, "We'll bring you more news as soon as we get it." And I thought, oh my God. So I got home, walked even more quickly, got home, started looking at the news, and then looking at the clock and thinking, I've got to speak with Faisal today, and trying not to be, I told you about, I always say journalism is an excuse for bad manners, a joke, but not really a joke. And I thought, just to warn you that I could be called away, but the news is breathtaking. They may have killed like almost the entire Hamas leadership. But just wait, as we speak, which is 7 minutes past 3 here in London on Tuesday, we're just waiting to see how many have been killed. Qatar is obviously furious. This is what happens in our life. You
Right.
think it's a gorgeous day.
Mm.
You're all I'm relaxing into having this conversation with you about my new book and about reporting in general, about journalism
Yeah.
in our time, and something happens. And Faisal, I think you would agree because you follow the region and beyond so closely. All of us have used this word unprecedented so many times that we're searching for new words.
Yeah.
Every time I think, "Oh my goodness, this is the biggest news this year," then next week,
It's something
even
new. Yeah.
bigger news, even bigger,
Well,
even bigger.
I want to come to some of the politics a little bit later when we talk about Gaza and the
Mm,
Middle East, but I want to focus on what it feels like for you in the moment. Because obviously, I mean, you've written this book, but you also have a life of your own. You have things you have planned, you have things you want to do. You made a joke earlier about maybe, preparing for a holiday, things like this. And what does it feel like when it's on a Tuesday? It's not even at an appropriate time. It's not Monday at 10 a.m. It's just on a
mm.
Tuesday. Maybe you have something planned. Like, that must be very, very frustrating that you live your life at the whims of other people's news.
Breaking news doesn't discriminate, not by day, not by hour, not in any way. It just happens when it happens, and it throws you. Most of all, let's be clear, it throws the people it's impacting the most. I was thinking about Faisal, you have friends in Doha as well. They were left reeling when there was an sudden Iranian attack on the Al Udeid military base, the biggest U.S. military base
Right.
in the region
Yeah.
during the Israel 12-day Israel-Iran war. And so I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what do any people we know live close? What are people feeling? Because it was always seen as as all of the cities in the Persian Gulf region as very, very safe places to be. So this really knocks us out. But I will say for all journalists and myself and my colleagues, we always say that one of the aspects of being a journalist who covers breaking news, the worst possible thing is letting people down. So for example, let's say my book launch was tonight. I wouldn't be able to miss my book launch. But what if I was going to have dinner tonight with some very good friends, and would I be confronted with, well, I'm sorry, I have to pull out, or would I find a way that I remember when I lived in Jerusalem, literally, I would go to a dinner party, sit down for the starter while they were waiting for the main course, go outside, do an interview, come back for the main course. Then, when they were waiting for dessert, go back out and do another interview. It's the nature of our business. It's very, very
But do you
unpredictable.
ever
And
feel? I mean, you've been doing it for
hmm.
so long now. Do you think that? Do you ever feel annoyed about it? Do you feel like the people conducting these news strikes? Do you think that they take something from you from your private life?
You do pay a price because if it happens time and again, now I'm living in London. When I lived in the Middle East, it did take over my life, such that when I moved back to London after 5 years in the Middle East, and that was it was a very volatile time,
Yeah.
suicide bombings, Jewish settlement expansion, peace talks, breakdown of peace talks. So when I came back to London, for a year, I insisted on not traveling, that not letting breaking news, the politics and in this case the Middle East, dictate my life. And here we are again. But again, I know you don't want you want me to say about my impact, but the people it impacts most of all are the people who are either under the bombs or close to the bombs, or whose own lives are impacted the
Yeah, I
most.
don't think anyone listening will think that you're being selfish and thinking about yourself in these situations. But I think the reason I was so interested in it while we were preparing for this is that it's been going on so long. You've
Yeah.
been covering, all of these big conflicts over the last 30 years. And at a certain point, do you ever feel like you just need a little bit of time for yourself, just to kind of live your own life? Because look,
Of
even with
course, of
other people, even with
course.
other professionals like doctors, for example, even they get time to live their own private lives, even though they're
Hmm.
doing very important work.
Well, I do work for a very big media organization, and so there are other people and very good people who've had as long experiences as I've had doing covering these stories, including the Middle East. So if I can't do it, someone else can
There's
do it,
other
and
people.
we can say no. We
Hmm.
can say no, and especially these past few years where it is just unrelenting. You have to for your peace of mind. You have to get away because it's again, we're only observers, but even as observers, it is profoundly painful to see this unraveling, this violence, this suffering, this humanitarian, the starvation.
Yeah.
It's really, really painful.
Well, we'll come to a lot of those later. Let's start with the book. So this is where we were going to start 13 minutes ago. You must be one of the few prominent journalists at the apex of global journalism, which I think is not unfair. I know you're a very modest person, but I think it's not unfair to say that that's where you are now. One of the few that hasn't written a book, and this is your first book. And so I was thinking, isn't it interesting, of all the conflicts, as you say, you were in Jerusalem for a long time, that you decided to write about Afghanistan and write about this particular way of looking at Afghanistan. You've called the book A People's History of Afghanistan. So I guess I should start by asking you why you chose the country, why that particular conflict.
It's interesting that you should ask this question, Faisal. I'm sure people have said to you, people have commented, they certainly have commented to me. They say that the kind of work that we do, journalism, the daily journalism is, next day it's the old classic, fish and chips wrapping. And that if you really want to do something which survives the test of time, you have to write a book. And the book is the gold standard for journalists. For a long time, I thought about it, and I thought it would be, I used to use the expression an albatross around my neck, in the sense of that I'd always be thinking about it. It would, just like we've been discussing, not only would breaking news take over my life, but having to get back to my desk to finish this darn book. And then more recently, I would say, and again, a joke, but not really a joke, that it was hard enough to finish emails, much less to finish a book. But you also need to have a story. You just can't put words on the paper. You need to have a way of telling the story. And I think it was about in 2019 where those of us who follow Afghanistan closely had a feeling that the wheel of history was going to turn again. Something dramatic was going to happen. The war was intensifying again, notwithstanding this huge international engagement, and the Taliban were gaining ground, and something would happen. And this is where the book starts, reporting from Afghanistan from Christmas in 1988, which was the Cold War. And that was just months before what was a major historic event, the Soviet troop withdrawal. And, you're podcasting now. We all, as journalists, have had to think of new ways of storytelling. So I decided I had to find a way to be ahead of the curve, to try to figure out what was going to happen, and try to find a way to be able to tell this story of what was happening. And to make a long story short, what I eventually came up with, and as it turned out, the launch of this podcast, A Wish for Afghanistan, landed right when the Taliban took over Kabul again in August of 2021. But I'd also been gathering more information. One of my editors had said, you need a conceit, you need a prism to tell the story. And she mentioned Anne Patchett's the Dutch House. And I love this idea. And I'd already been thinking of using Palace Number 1 in Kabul, Kasr-e, where I met the families of various Afghan presidents down through the decades. But I realized I didn't have enough of the story and not enough of the history had gone through the palace. And then I went back to the Intercontinental Hotel, a landmark hotel in Kabul, high on a hill, this modern palace of glass and steel, which had been opened with great fanfare when Afghanistan was a kingdom, and it was a time of bikinis at the swimming pool, cocktails on the roof, escargot, and it had been my first Afghan home. It was still called Intercontinental, but of course the Intercontinental chain pulled out when the Soviets moved in Christmas of 1979. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought that this hotel could be a prism to tell a broader story about Afghanistan, because I reunited with some of the people I'd known since I lived at the hotels. They still remembered me. I remembered them. We remembered our stories. I met new people of this new 20-something generation who were working at the hotel. And so that's how I started. And even my publisher later confessed, he said, Lise, I wasn't quite sure you'd have enough of the history in the hotel. But so much happened there. History literally lived within its walls, and it's still there in the bullet holes and the marble floor in the restaurant where there was a suicide bombing, or by the lift on the 5th floor in the penthouse where again there was a massive suicide bombing. The memories live in that hotel. So that's how it started. And the other thing I'll mention, Faisal, is something again that I'm sure you and your colleagues think of too. It also dovetailed with the time where there was this expression in our profession about news avoidance that people were saying, we were saying to ourselves, oh, the news is so depressing. The news is so painful. It's so unbearable. Even I found myself switching the dial on the radio to Radio 3, BBC Radio 3, classical music rather than BBC Radio 4. And I thought I need to find another way to tell these stories. And ever since I've been traveling, since I left Canada after my graduate degree, every time I went to a new place, I always read novels or narrative history, history where history lives on the pages. The characters come alive in the pages, in the stories. And so it was a risk, Faisal, I have to be clear. A, I didn't know whether I would like writing a book, whether I could write a book, and what readers would think about the book I would write. So by some miracle, the book is now finished.
It is interesting because sometimes when you think about people's books, they are kind of a reflection of the person writing them. And I think in your case, it's completely unsurprising in some ways that, and the audience will understand now because they've seen how keen you are to put the focus on the people who, who really are affected by the news, that this, even though it is a work about Afghanistan and it's a work about your time there and all these decades that you've spent there, so much of the book is about other people. It's about the stories that other people have been through. And consistently throughout the book, the focus is on what is happening to these characters, what is happening to the country, what is happening to anyone other than the main protagonist, Lyse Doucet. And it seems like it's such a way that it reflects the way that you think about the world, even in your journalism, that you want to tell their story, even when you are to some degree using yourself as a vehicle.
I still think the best of journalism is the journalism we tell about others. And this is very much part of my generation. I think in this new generation about social media, it's about, the grammar is their face on the screen. And I understand that people in some ways can relate more intimately to a story if they somehow relate to the storyteller.
Right.
And that for some media, particularly I think American media, although it's becoming the case even on this side of the pond and in other parts of the world, as I just alluded to, that people like the storyteller to be part of the story. But I'm still of that generation and of that genre which believes that I'm the one who's telling the story. It's not my own story. I am in the book in the third person because I realized at a certain point that in order to tell the story of some of the characters, I was in their story.
You're a part of it,
So
right,
I
right.
found a way, and I said to my publisher, Rowan Bouchers, who was brilliant, I said, I'm not quite sure how to put myself into it. Some friends said, oh, you could do little sidebars, italicized print that people would know that it's it's you musing or it's you being part of it. But as is often the case, and I'm sure you've had this yourself, Faisal, when you sit down and the words stumble on the page and they form sentences and stories, this is the way it came out. It came out in the third person because I don't want to reveal everything in the book, but because I had the privilege of reporting from Afghanistan, where the polls said 95% of Afghans were listening to the BBC in Dari and in Pashto, literally. And I don't think it's apocryphal that the fighting would stop in the early evening, so that the fighters on both sides, in this case, it was the Soviet-backed government in Kabul and the Western-backed Mujahideen fighting against them in the countryside, they would stop and listen to the BBC to hear who was winning the war. And here I was, sending my dispatches to London. Time, of course, no internet, no social media, hardly any telephone lines. And so it would be translated in London. And the way it would come out in Dari and Pashto is that my name was one word. So Afghans would call me Lyse Doucet, that it would be one word. So in the book, I became Lyse Doucet. But I would also mention that I also returned at the end of the book, because that was when in August and September of 2021, when the hotel was then, it's a government run hotel. So the whole arc of the story is whoever runs Afghanistan, whoever sets the rules in Afghanistan, sets the rules in the Intercon. So the Taliban were back, and it was, as you know, in Arabic, same Fedayeen, the suicide bombers or the would-be suicide bombers, the assassins, the people who had been on the other side of the war. And the staff, of course, felt vulnerable. Some were scared. They didn't know what it would be like to work for these young talibs. So I had to make it clear that the stories were told to me,
Hmm.
not to someone else, so that they wouldn't say, "Who
Who
told
told
Lyse
this
Doucet
story?
that story?"
Yeah.
And it was a genuine thing. I didn't make it up. So I put myself back in to say, this manager who used to be an assassin and now wants to study to be a doctor, he told me. So again, I needed the device to be part of the story. So I think it was sensible story writing. Yeah, quite frankly, Faiz, I mean, I can't even bear to sit down on my computer and think about myself all day. So to have to write my memoir, and I don't think, maybe people outside our tribe would say, "Oh, wow, you should write your memoir." But inside our tribe of journalists and fellow travelers, my story is not unique. Yes, I've seen a lot. I've traveled a lot. I've taken risks. I've had the great privilege of being able to tell stories, mainly because people have opened up their hearts and homes to me, as is the case. But my story is not something that's going to make people sit up in bed and go and read through the morning because it's such a page turner. The thing about literature too is, if you read the great writers about literature, Susan Sontag, the Salman Rushdie, they talk about how literature can expand our empathy, can take us out of our own worlds. And all the people listening to this podcast who read novels, who read stories, we all grow up wanting to tell stories, read stories, hear stories. And so I was hoping that it is a book about Afghanistan, but it's a broader book about what are the spaces in between and people who live with such a turbulent history, who live in war. Because if you watch the news, you listen to the news, what do you see in areas racked by war? People running away from the bombs, people, enveloped in smoke, people in the rubble, people crying in the hospital, people moaning. But they wake up like us every day. And what happens in between? How do they find this everyday courage to go on, in this case, to go to work, to maintain their professional pride and working at a hotel, to serve the customers who come in? And hospitality is one so deeply ingrained in Afghan society, which made the hotel a very suitable prism. They organize weddings, they go to weddings, they hold their loved ones close. I wanted to tell those kinds of stories, and it's up to the readers to decide whether this is something that resonates with them.
And where do you think the answer lies then? Where do they find the courage to keep going, especially in a place like Afghanistan, where as we were looking through the breadth of the story. I mean, you go from the fall of King Shah, and then the Soviet invasion, communist rule, the rise of the Mujahideen, then you have the civil war in the 90s. Already that's several lifetimes of news. Then you get to the Taliban, then the 1990s come, then we have 9/11, the invasion, and so on and so on. This is a long, long period of life. And for some of the people that you talk about who have experienced quite a few of those decades, I mean, it must seem like they've lived multiple lifetimes. How do they find the courage to do
Yeah,
it?
it's always really struck me about this Afghanistan. Maybe a better historian than I am will challenge me on this, but I don't have another country which has basically had to endure and live and survive every possible political system the world has known. They've had a kingdom, they've had communism, Soviet backed communism, they've had warlordism, they've had Islamism, they've had wannabe democracy bankrolled
Liberal
by
intervention.
the
Yeah.
West. Yes, everything. So it's always really struck me that part of it is, cursed by geography, being landlocked, being at and what was at least before. It's less so now. Who knows whether we'll come back and emerge in this way again? But it's been cursed by its geography, and yet I've always really been struck how Afghans still keep their sense of self, and in keeping their sense of self, they keep their wonderful sense of humor. Of course, in all those years of war, it's often a very black humor. You've seen that in other societies too, Faisal. But people have to find ways to carry on. And Afghans say, and other cultures say it too, is that the last to die is hope. But I remember in those last years where it seemed that it was all but certain that the Taliban would return to power, either will seize power or through negotiations, but more and more likely to seize power. And when the suicide bombings were intensifying, there were these sticky bombs in Kabul, assassination attempts. Afghans began to say, Lise, we used to say that the last thing to die is hope, and we will always hold on to hope. But they say we have lost hope. When we say goodbye to friends, we don't say see you soon or see you later, because there's a very good chance we won't see you later, that this goodbye is the last goodbye. And I know that sounds morbid, but that was how they lived, where life and death was measured in minutes, in days, in the decision to take one street and not another, to spend more time at the cafe or to go home, to go to work or not to go to work. That's how life became. It was really dancing with death. Of course, it's quieter now, and there have been calm periods. Let's be honest; it's not always been a shooting match, but so much of it was so turbulent. There they were. They were, what really struck me about the hotel, the cook still kept pots on the boil, the housekeepers still put new sheets on the bed, the waiters still waited, the bellboys still carried the luggage. The hotel went on, in good or bad. They except for a few days here and there, never shut the doors. The hotel was a survivor, and the people who kept it going. So for me, it was a very Afghan hotel in that sense of being a survivor.
It's a tricky story to tell, I think, because obviously Kabul is only one part of the country. And so
Yes.
sometimes I felt, like particularly when I was reading the section on, it's called The Years of Light and Dark. This is post 2001. And I thought that was a really interesting section because it's very dynamic. Women are coming back to work, and to some degree, a lot of the country is starting to flourish within the security belt. But I wondered if that was perhaps the point at which the efficacy of the hotel as a vehicle for the story started to maybe shake a bit, because I thought perhaps it would be much easier to find out what was happening in the countryside at that point, because not what was happening in Kabul wasn't happening in the countryside. There were a lot of night raids with the American soldiers. There's a lot of things that were happening in that long period, some of which led to the fall of Kabul and the takeover by the Taliban. So I wonder if you think that of course it is a very Kabul story and an Afghan story, but at the same time there are some parts of the broader Afghan story that just aren't told.
Well, you can't tell everything. And it's a truth of all societies. I look in Britain, that so much is decided from London. The capital is where people migrate, even people from the countryside. They weren't immune from the raids. They had cousins in the countryside, things that were happening there. But what happens in the countryside doesn't stay in the countryside. But the decisions about what was happening in Afghanistan were being made in Kabul all the way through this history. And it will only be telling certain stories and not all the stories, but the stories that the hotel was able to tell were very much emblematic of the time and what was happening to people. And bear in mind that a lot of people came from the provinces. Young students came to study in the English language centers and to learn computing, to go to Kabul University. That's traditionally always been the case in Afghanistan. Quite frankly, in most societies, the migration to the cities. So whereas the people in the villages were experiencing the night raids by US backed forces, by elite trained Afghans, they were bearing the brunt of Taliban attacks. The hotel was also being attacked by the Taliban, was also being parts of it being gutted. People were living in fear in the streets of Kabul. So it was not entirely different. It took a different form, but I would argue that you still got the sense of the arc from the hope of 2001 when the Taliban were ousted, and then the arc, and then the opportunities and the optimism, and then the steady decline through the years, and then the growing violence. But your point is well taken. But my emphasis in this was to tell a story and not to suddenly put so much information into it that I would lose the readers.
I wonder if we can broaden the conversation a bit beyond Afghanistan to some of the other places that you've covered. And there's a lot, so I wasn't going to choose a particular country. I thought I was going to ask you to do it. But I was wondering, of all the places that you have been to and these stories that you have covered, Which one do you feel now is the most shocking? So we've talked about, I mean, how you arrived in 88 and then very shortly after with the withdrawal of the Soviet forces. That was a world historical event, quite a shocking historical event. But I wonder if there were other events over the subsequent decades that you feel are more astonishing or that impacted you more strongly.
There are so many, and we wouldn't have time to mention all of them, but off the top of my head, two immediately come to mind. The kind that really that leave you shocked, that stop you in your tracks, and the memory never leaves you. One of them was the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, where this major natural disaster swept across the region. And I started in India, in the fishing village in Nagapatnam, which was devastated by this mighty monster of the waves. And then I went to Indonesia. I went to Banda Aceh, which is one of the worst affected areas. And I still remember standing there and in front of me an absolute wasteland. And to think that in seconds, everything was taken away from people. Everything they knew and loved and held dear, both physical and human. And the people who survived, who were still left standing, were starting life from zero. And you'd look at the rubble, and of course you do this as well in war zones, as a child's toy, a bit of clothing, this the notebook, the crumpled pages of the notebook. And I remember just thinking then, and this is way before we really talked about the climate emergency, but just thinking that of the power, the brute force of nature. And that, of course, is a natural disaster. But then let me also mention a moment which was not a natural disaster, which is in Syria, in the suburb of Yarmouk, which is a predominantly Palestinian area of the Syrian capital, which was one of the areas which had a siege imposed on it, the surrender or starve medieval tactic used by President Assad's forces. It became a real drive for me to try to explain to people, what does it mean to be under siege? And this is years now before what's happening now in Sudan, in Gaza, and other places, where not a piece of bread is getting in and not a single person is getting out. And I managed to get the permission to go into Yarmouk, and it was overwhelming that I had never. Again, the houses were gutted and charred, where they were skeletal remains, but this was man-made. This was the result of incessant bombardments and fighting between the armed groups inside Yarmouk and the Syrian government forces. But I had never seen, and I had seen a lot in Syria by then, such devastation, such desperation of people dying to get out. It just knocked all of us sideways.
I'd like to take those one at a time. So I was in Aceh as well. And I remember having actually very similar experience, because Aceh, for those who don't know, faces west across I should know which ocean it is, the Indian Ocean, I guess.
Indian Ocean. Yeah.
And so when the tsunami came in, I mean, there's just nothing that you can do. There's nowhere to escape to. And exactly like you say, the devastation is it's on a biblical scale, because it just completely takes everything away. But it made me think that it isn't just natural disasters that have this impact on people. I mean, for the Afghans and for other places as well, it must have seemed sometimes like these forces that were overwhelming, that they just couldn't stop the war coming to them. And you couldn't protect your family from it. There was nothing that you could do.
As you know, Faisal, in many of these societies, they believe it's all kismet. It's written in the book. It's God's will. And there's this sort of this stoic fatalism that God decides and our time will come. You hear it a lot in war zones, where the missiles, the bombs are falling, the bullets are whistling past. And as journalists, more and more now, we're much more cognizant of risk. We take cover. Of course, they do too. But they just say, well, we are all going to die someday. God decides. And that kind of optimistic fatalism that God will take care of you. And a lot of societies that I've worked, they don't see natural disasters as natural. They also see them as punishment by God, or they're happening. Everything happens for a reason. I grew up as a Catholic. Even my mother used to say everything is meant to be.
But don't you think that the pessimism and the kismet comes after the exposure to these disasters, man-made or political or whatever it is? That after a certain point, when where you can't stop the bombs or you can't stop the ocean coming or something like this, at a certain point you develop that as a mechanism. Because we were talking earlier about how much of war zones are just like sliding doors moments. You can go down this road or that road. You can take this car or that car. You can go to and sometimes you never come back. Sometimes you come back and you're not intact. I wonder if it is the war and the disaster that brings about the feeling of kismet, not the other way around.
In other ways, it becomes a defense to carry on.
I mean, how do you?
It's kind of.
Yeah, how do you? Even in the Afghanistan story that we're talking about, how do you carry on for decades of uncertainty? If you look at the timeline of Afghanistan, there has not been a single complete decade where you had some stability and some certainty. That means that every single person is affected by that. I mean, you and I know 10 years is such a short period of time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people talk about reeling from, 6 prime ministers, or, this, it's uncertainty on an epic scale, hence how much trauma there is. And I remember in 2001, I was then spending a lot of time in Kabul after the fall of the Taliban and the beginning of the new order, and a woman came to our gate and she was clearly traumatized. And then I asked around with the aid agencies saying, is there anyone who can help this widow? She really, really needs help. She needs counseling. And they all came back and said, no, we don't have any programs for that. And I was really startled. And this was a country which has already been through decades of war. Now I think there are more resources, but I think uh, someone who's an expert in trauma would say one of the best ways to deal with trauma is to get you out of the circumstances causing the trauma. But there is no time for that when you're living in a war zone.
Yeah.
People develop defenses, but they suffer inside. And sadly, I mean, this is not the place to discuss it, but obviously it sometimes is manifested in increasing violence at home. Women suffer the impact
Yeah.
of people dealing with this bruising. They're being battered by circumstances beyond their control, the uncertainty, the violence, the never ending sense of loss, the profound pain, that helplessness. It does come out. It comes out in some way, hence the urgency of trying to do everything possible to end wars before they end up ending the people who are being fought over.
Well, let's take the other example of Yarmouk in Syria, because, of course, when you talk about the starvation siege, I mean, there is nothing related to the trauma, of course, nothing more clear than what is happening now in Gaza. I mean, the shocking part about what is happening in Gaza, I think, is not the silence, because it is endlessly reported, but I think the feeling of impotence. And I wonder if you feel that, even in your elevated position at the BBC, that it's so difficult for us to keep telling these stories and actually see any changes. It's been 2 years now, 3 years.
Everyone I meet on a senior level, no matter what government, no matter what institution, whether they're working for an aid agency, whether they're working for a think tank, if it's someone I know well, I meet them. And the first thing I say is, how is the war going to end? Is it possible to stop this war? And when I say that, I'm thinking, of course, of the innocent Palestinians, the children who are suffering in unprecedented ways. Children always suffer the brunt of wars, of course, the smallest, the most vulnerable. I'm thinking about the Israeli hostages, to see the agony and anger of the families waiting for their loved ones to come home. And it
The
just
years.
it just goes on and on. And it doesn't seem, this is not the podcast to discuss how the war is going to end. And we're always, all of us as journalists are accused, and the BBC, because the BBC is big and it's a public broadcaster, does come under huge criticism from all sides. It has to be said, accused of taking sides. It's drilled into us as public broadcasters is that, we don't take sides. Our job is to report on all sides. But, I have no hesitation in taking the side of innocent children, of innocent hostages. Those are the people who are suffering in profoundly painful ways now. None of us can begin to imagine the depth of the hunger, the starvation, the loss, whole generations wiped out.
Yeah.
And that's putting aside the politics, if it's possible to do that.
It's hard to put aside the politics, right? Because
It
it's
is
not.
because it's a war. Yes, it's
Yeah,
being.
I mean, even this is part of the difficulty, and I know you face this on a daily basis with the BBC. The terminology is complicated. I mean, even when you talk about it being a war, it's not really a war. It's it's an enclave that is being attacked and besieged, and it's very tricky, I think, in that situation to know how to report the story in a way that gives a coherence to the broader story, but also kind of replicates the reality of people living under famine and under siege. Do you find that daily you have these conversations with your colleagues, or do you think that it is something that every once in a while you come back to it and you say, okay, well, what are we doing exactly? How are we reporting this story?
First of all, the BBC has a big team on this story, possibly one of the biggest teams of any broadcaster. We have a morning team based in Jerusalem, and we have an afternoon team. We have people in the occupied West Bank. We have Palestinian journalists who sadly have had to leave Gaza. We have people in other capitals. We're TV, radio, online. We are constantly looking at this story
Hmm.
and trying to find ways to report on it, because we started off by discussing every day something happens, and we are
Correct.
there to report on it the best. Yes, we get criticism. All we can do is continue to do what our job as a journalist requires us to do. It's made much, much more difficult because we can't get into Gaza. We were there in 2014. I was there myself. Many of my colleagues were. We weren't allowed in 2009. This time, there's every journalist who's wants there'd be probably be journalists listening who've been in the same boat. Everyone, there's no substitute for the old fashioned face to face on the ground in the heat and the dust, seeing it, feeling it, living through it, that kind of journalism. And we don't have that in
Hmm.
Gaza. We have incredibly brave Palestinian journalists who are paying with their lives to tell their story to the world. Their reporting is nothing short of heroic. And thanks to them, we do have stories. But if you're asking me, it make my job, own personal job, is more difficult because I'm not there. And if you're talking to people at the BBC, we have trusted freelancers that we work with there, but we're not on the ground.
Yeah. I mean, do you think that part of it is that the BBC has not hired Gazan journalists, and that would give them some protection, perhaps, which hasn't happened?
So I'm not privy to the. We have Palestinian journalists who work with us. We're for the BBC Arabic service, or for us on the English services. They had to leave for their safety, and we have very strong relationships with some of the freelancers there. I'm not privy to the discussions about what they're paid, how they're paid, what the freelance arrangements are, and I think it would not be right for us to discuss it. Yeah.
Let's talk about memory and reporting, because you were talking about Afghanistan having been there for many decades, 1988. There are not that many reporters today, in the nicest way, but who have that memory, even from books. And so I wonder sometimes about the depth of the reporting, the depth of the understanding of what is happening. Like sometimes when you come to the story now, for example, you're coming to it, not you, I mean another reporter, they're coming to it having not known so much of this history. And they're perhaps not able to put it into the right context for the readers and for the audience. I wonder if you feel that, because you must see a lot of younger journalists, not necessarily in Afghanistan, but in other places as well, where they're coming to it brand new and they don't have the knowledge of what happened a decade ago, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, even from books, not from experiences.
I have two views on that.
Hmm.
One is, and both of us are in this category, that the what do we call it? People who have hinterland. The fact that we've been there on the ground, in the not just in the margins of history, right smack in the middle of history, of course, gives us the context, the feel, the understanding of a story that is invaluable in reporting, because there always is. Some things don't just happen out of the blue. They are an event which comes after a very long social, political history.
Right.
And so that's really, really an important resource when you're reporting. But equally, I am a fervent believer in what I call the original eye. When I go to places, for example, I just went to Iran for the first time in 10 years, and I went with a camera person who'd been there before, but a young journalist who'd never been there before. And she would ask different questions than me. And similarly, when I've gone to Afghanistan with someone who's been there for the first time, they will ask questions that I've stopped asking because they're seeing it for the first time. And they will say, "Well, what about this?" And I would think, "Oh, yeah, 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 you're right. You're right. Oh, so why aren't we doing something on this?" And I would say, "Well, uh, oh yeah,
And you
okay."
already had that answer
Yeah,
maybe
I
10
was saying
years ago.
because we have this expression sometimes new readers start here. In some ways, they reflect. They're more reflective of our listeners and viewers
Right.
who are also
Because the audience
just
is
starting out.
right.
Yes, the audience is new,
Yeah.
and so sometimes and I don't want to use the word simplify, but some things which they find really interesting and should be highlighted, I would have not looked at them. And I always say that with travel, your eyes are different. Every time you go to a new place, your eyes change because you see it in a different way. So I think the best kind of journalism is when you have a team, and if you're obviously when you're a newspaper journalist, you sometimes have to go on your own. Is that you have in your team new eyes and old eyes, and then you have a different kind of a perspective on the story. I really believe that both are needed in order to have the best kind of journalism, which has both depth as well as a broader perspective.
I mean, you're certainly right about the having the new eyes. I mean, you've seen a lot of the the new journalism on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube and other places, and you see how sometimes the things that we all think we know, they are interrogating, they are asking for the first time. And sometimes if you look at it, it can seem, as we were saying earlier, it can seem simplistic. But actually it isn't simplistic, because for a whole new generation of readers and viewers, they have no idea. They want to know the question. They might look, I'm trying to think of an example, but they might look at Afghanistan and say, well, why is Afghanistan under sanctions? Or why don't
Mm,
they have this kind of system of government? Or
mm.
why do they have this odd relationship with America or this odd relationship with Pakistan? Like that. The kind of questions that perhaps you, I mean, you're smiling now, but the kind of questions that you might have answered 2 decades ago to yourself, and maybe at the time also explained to the audience, they haven't got those answers, and so they need to hear them brand new. I'm very interested. I mean, we're talking about on a podcast, but I'm very interested in this new brand of, I'm trying to think of a less derogatory term, but kind of idiot broadcasters. The kind of, and I don't mean it in a derogatory way, although it sounds it, but it means that people whose podcasts, like Joe Rogan, they know nothing about the subject and they are discovering it in real time as they are talking. So perhaps one of the best examples most recently was this podcast where they had Benjamin Netanyahu on, and they're talking to him and they just have to take what he says as truth because they have no hinterland. The same thing with Joe Rogan when he interviewed Donald Trump. Donald Trump was able to talk to him for 3 hours, and Joe Rogan does not have the information to be able to say, I don't think that is what happened. And there's an enormous value to it, perhaps not in that specific instance, but in general, there's an enormous value for the audience in hearing these stories at the exact same time that the broadcaster, the host, does as well. And that is a completely different way of doing journalism to the way that you are used to, where you are the repository of facts. You know things going into it. You go out of your way to educate yourself on the subject so that when you go before the camera, you're not just saying, I don't know, that is a nice looking hotel, actually. I don't know where it's from. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, for example, the India-Pakistan war erupted earlier this year, and I was listening to the coverage, and I'm thinking, why aren't you looking at China? China's a big, and why? I was there 80, 89 when the Kashmiris in Pakistani Kashmir marched to the border, and it was the start of, and of course, the Pakistani support for the militant groups came out of the Afghan war. And I remember calling up one of the programs and I said, don't you think you should be looking at this side of the story? Because we had, there are people reporting on it who are just starting to, but I was listening and watching with a different, I was thinking, think we should look at this too.
Yeah.
We should. It was that sort of thing. As we speak, you have in Nepal
Yeah.
a moment of a huge political moment where I'm listening on the BBC before I joined you that they're calling it Generation Z, as we now say. They've brought down the government because they were on social media talking about corruption, and maybe some older journalists would say, "Oh yes, the corruption, it's part of life. You're never going to get rid of corruption."
Right.
And there you go, journalists. Well, why not? Let's get rid of corruption.
Right.
Yes, it's the why. Yes, exactly what you say. Why not? Yes, maybe that journalism school, the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, and why not, or wow.
I'm going to now start taking us towards the end. You said earlier no journalist would ask you why you haven't written a memoir. Sadly, that is one of my questions. But why have you chosen not to write a memoir? Because I know you say that you wouldn't want to put yourself front and center of the story, but you have. I mean, objectively, you've lived a fascinating life. Why would you? But I think that's true. I think most of the audience would accept that.
I don't know.
But do you really not think that, Lyse? I mean,
I don't know, but I'm not.
Do you know? You must know.
I've so many friends that they've lived a life. I'll get back to you on that question. Right now, it's not on my agenda. But if something really, really, maybe after this podcast, I can write about this podcast because it's such an interesting part of my life.
Lyse Doucet, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's lovely to speak with you.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Lyse Doucet's book, The Finest Hotel in Kabul, A People's History of Afghanistan, is out this Thursday, September 19th, online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.